Before watching this video, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Now let's dive into the story. It was a warm spring morning. Sunlight streaming through the half-open windows of the cozy suburban home Emma and Mark had built together. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, sat at the kitchen table, her curly blonde hair catching the light as she colored intently. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, peaceful, but Emma knew better. Beneath the surface, her marriage was slowly unraveling, and she felt powerless to stop it. Mark, her husband of 8 years, sat across from Sophia, half-heartedly reading the morning paper while sipping his coffee. His tie was crooked, his brow furrowed, and his focus was anywhere but on the family before him. Emma stood by the sink, washing the breakfast dishes, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of her loneliness pressed against her chest. "Mark, are you working late again tonight?" Emma asked, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. Mark didn't look up from the paper. "Yeah, I've got a meeting with the regional team. Don't wait up for me." Emma bit her lip to keep herself from snapping. It was always the same answer. Always work. She glanced at Sophia, who had stopped coloring and was now watching her parents with wide, innocent eyes. For her sake, Emma forced a smile. "All right, don't forget to take your lunch." Mark nodded absent-mindedly, folding the paper and rising from the table. He kissed Sophia on the head, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the door. "See you later," he called over his shoulder. "Bye, Daddy," Sophia chirped, her voice filled with an excitement that Emma envied. Emma stood frozen, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. She wanted to scream, to demand that Mark see her, talk to her, be with her. But instead, she swallowed her frustration, wiped her hands, and turned to Sophia with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "All right, sweetheart. Time to get ready for school." The days blurred together in a monotonous routine. Mark left early and returned late, barely acknowledging Emma beyond the occasional nod or grunt. Sophia was Emma's only source of joy, but even her innocent giggles couldn't fill the void left by her husband's growing absence. It wasn't long before Richard, Mark's father, began visiting more frequently. At first, Emma welcomed his company. He was good with Sophia, always bringing small gifts or telling stories that made her laugh. He even helped with household tasks, fixing leaky faucets or trimming the hedges in the backyard. "Emma, you've been working too hard," Richard said one afternoon as he handed her a cup of tea. They were sitting on the porch, watching Sophia chase butterflies in the yard. "You need to take some time for yourself." Emma laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Time for myself? Between Sophia, the house, and Mark's schedule, I'm lucky if I get 5 minutes to breathe." Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Mark's always been a workaholic. Even as a kid he was driven, but he should know better than to take you for granted." The comment caught Emma off guard. She glanced at Richard, who was looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. She quickly looked away, brushing off the feeling. "He's just trying to provide for us. I understand that." "Providing isn't just about money," Richard said quietly. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Over the next few weeks, Richard's visits became a regular occurrence. He brought groceries, fixed broken appliances, and even offered to babysit Sophia so Emma could have some time to herself. At first, Emma was grateful, but soon she began to notice the way Richard looked at her, the lingering glances, the subtle compliments. "You look beautiful today," he said one afternoon as they stood in the kitchen. Emma was preparing lunch, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans. She laughed nervously. "I think your eyesight's going, Richard. I'm a mess." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You're far from a mess, Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. She turned away, focusing on slicing the vegetables in front of her. "Thank you," she mumbled, her cheeks burning. Richard didn't say anything more, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emma tried to push it aside, to tell herself she was imagining things. But the seed had been planted, and it was growing despite her best efforts to ignore it. One evening, after Sophia had gone to bed and Mark was working late, Richard stayed to help Emma with some repairs in the laundry room. They worked side by side, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. "You know," Richard said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "you're doing an incredible job holding this family together." Emma looked at him, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers as he took the wrench from her grasp. "Mark doesn't know how lucky he is to have you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She was acutely aware of how close he was, of the way his gaze lingered on her face. "I should go," she said abruptly, stepping back. "It's getting late." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course. I'll see myself out." But as he left, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope for Emma. Every interaction with Richard carried an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. She found herself second-guessing her reactions, her words, even the way she moved around him. And yet, she couldn't deny that his attention had awakened something inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Mark's growing absence only added fuel to the fire. He was always at the office or engrossed in work when he was home, barely sparing Emma more than a glance. Sophia noticed it too, asking, "Why doesn't Daddy play with me anymore?" Emma had no answer, only the ache of guilt that she wasn't enough to bridge the gap between her husband and their family. Richard's visits continued, each one blurring the boundaries a little more. It was during one of these visits, late on a rainy evening, that everything began to unravel. Emma stood in the living room, her arms crossed as she watched the rain streak down the windows. Sophia was asleep upstairs, and the house was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Richard was fixing the cabinet hinge that had been creaking for months, his hands steady and sure. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to dream about a life like this, a warm home, a family, peace." Emma turned to look at him, her expression softening. "You don't feel like you have that now?" Richard shook his head, chuckling dryly. "After my wife passed, the house felt empty. I thought I'd get used to it, but I never did. That's why I enjoy being here. It reminds me of what I had, what I lost." Emma's chest tightened. "I'm sorry, Richard. I didn't realize you felt that way." He set the screwdriver down and leaned against the counter, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't need to apologize, Emma. If anything, I should be thanking you. You've been so kind, so patient with me. I see the way you keep this family together, even when Mark doesn't appreciate it. You're incredible." Emma's breath hitched. She looked away, trying to compose herself. "Richard, Before she could finish, he stepped closer, closing the gap between them. His hand reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You deserve so much more than this, Emma. More than being taken for granted. More than being ignored." Her heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to put an end to this before it went any further. But she didn't move. She stood frozen, caught between the weight of her loneliness and the dangerous pull of Richard's presence. "You should go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard hesitated, his hand lingering near her cheek. "Emma." "Please," she said, stepping back. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she said quickly, her voice soft. "It's just complicated." Richard gave her a small, sad smile. "I understand." He left without another word, leaving Emma alone with her racing thoughts and the undeniable truth that she had let things go too far. But the line, once crossed, was impossible to redraw. A week later, Richard returned to babysit Sophia while Emma ran errands. When she came home, she found Sophia asleep on the couch, her coloring book still clutched in her tiny hands. Richard was in the kitchen, washing the dishes. "You didn't have to do that," Emma said, setting her keys on the counter. "It's the least I can do," Richard replied, smiling. "You've got enough on your plate." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Emma could feel his eyes on her, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "Richard," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But before she could say anything more, he closed the distance between them, his hands gently cupping her face. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and urgent. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her heart was a storm of emotions: guilt, longing, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. And then, she kissed him. The kiss was tentative at first, a fragile thing that could have been broken by the smallest hesitation. But when he deepened it, pulling her closer, Emma surrendered to the moment, to the fire that had been smoldering between them for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, Emma's chest heaved with the weight of what they had done. "This is wrong," she said, her voice shaky. "I know," Richard replied, his forehead resting against hers. "But I can't stop." Neither could she. The affair began in secret, hidden in the quiet moments when Mark was at work and Sophia was at school. Emma hated herself for it, for the lies and the deception. But with Richard she felt seen, desired, alive. He filled the void that Mark had left, and she clung to that feeling like a lifeline. Richard, for his part, seemed just as torn. He knew the risk they were taking, the damage it could cause. But he couldn't stay away from Emma no matter how hard he tried. The turning point came one fateful evening when Mark came home early, catching Emma and Richard in the middle of an embrace. "What the hell is this?" Mark's voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. Emma and Richard sprang apart, guilt written all over their faces. "Mark, I can explain," Emma began, but he cut her off. "Explain?" he spat, his face red with rage. "You're cheating on me, with my father." Sophia, awakened by the commotion, stood at the top of the stairs, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Daddy," she called out, her voice trembling. The sight of their daughter's tear-streaked face was enough to break Emma's heart. She realized in that moment just how far she had fallen and how much she stood to lose. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, his fists clenched, his face a mask of betrayal and fury. Emma's heart pounded as Sophia's voice broke the silence again. "Daddy, what's wrong?" the little girl asked, her small figure illuminated by the soft glow of the hallway light. "Nothing, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice softening for a moment as he looked at his daughter. "Go back to bed." Sophia hesitated, her eyes darting between her parents and her grandfather, sensing the tension in the room. Emma took a deep breath and stepped toward the stairs. "I'll take her," she said, her voice trembling. Mark glared at her but said nothing as Emma scooped Sophia into her arms and carried her upstairs. She tucked the little girl into bed, whispering reassurances even as her mind raced with fear and regret. When she returned to the living room, Richard was gone. Mark stood by the window, his back to her, staring out into the darkness. "Mark," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," he said, his tone cold and final. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "I can't believe you would do this to me, to us, with him of all people." Emma's chest tightened. "It wasn't planned. Don't you dare try to justify this," he snapped, cutting her off. "You betrayed me, Emma. You betrayed our family." Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to find the right words. "I was lonely, Mark. You've been so distant, so consumed by work. I felt invisible." Mark's jaw tightened. "So what? That gives you the right to sleep with my father?" "It wasn't about that," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to, but you let it happen," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Do you have any idea what you've done? How this will affect Sophia? How it will destroy everything we've built?" Emma sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "I know I've ruined everything," she said, her voice muffled. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark shook his head, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Emma. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done." The days that followed were a whirlwind of pain and confusion. Mark moved into the guest room, refusing to speak to Emma except when absolutely necessary. Sophia, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, sensed the change and clung to her mother, asking repeatedly when things would go back to normal. Richard tried to reach out, leaving voicemails and sending texts, but Emma ignored them. She couldn't face him, not after what had happened. She knew she had to focus on repairing the damage she'd done, but every time she looked at Mark, she saw the walls he'd built around himself, shutting her out completely. One evening, Mark finally broke the silence. "I want a divorce," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Emma felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. "Mark, please," she begged, "don't do this. We can fix this. For Sophia's sake, we have to try." He shook his head. "I can't, Emma. Every time I look at you, all I see is him. All I feel is betrayal." Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with him, but his resolve was unshakable. The next day, he met with a lawyer, and the process of ending their marriage began. Richard, meanwhile, was dealing with his own fallout. Mark had confronted him privately, their conversation devolving into a heated argument that ended with Mark telling his father he was no longer welcome in their lives. "You were supposed to be someone I could trust," Mark had said, his voice thick with anger and pain. "But you destroyed that. You destroyed everything." Richard had tried to apologize, but his words fell on deaf ears. He left Mark's house that day, knowing there was no way to undo the damage he'd caused. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Emma moved into a small apartment with Sophia, trying to rebuild her life piece by piece. She focused on being the best mother she could be, pouring all her energy into giving her daughter a sense of stability. Mark, for his part, threw himself into his work, using the distraction to keep his emotions at bay. He rarely saw his father, and when he did, their interactions were strained and brief. As for Richard, he tried to reach out to Emma a few times, but she made it clear that their relationship was over. "We made a mistake," she told him. "I can't go down that road again." He nodded, accepting her decision, but the regret lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of what they'd lost. Years later, Emma would look back on that time in her life with a mixture of sadness and clarity. She had made mistakes, terrible, life-altering mistakes, but she had also learned from them. She had learned the value of honesty, the importance of communication, and the necessity of forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself. Sophia, now a teenager, would occasionally ask about her father and grandfather, sensing the unspoken tension that still lingered between them. Emma would simply say, "It's complicated," knowing that some wounds never fully heal. And while she would always carry the weight of her choices, she also knew that life was about moving forward, about finding light even in the darkest of times. Because in the end, that was all any of them could do.